I am excited to introduce Ryan Carle, who was born and raised here in the Eastern Sierra in Mono City, and then went to UC Santa Cruz. And you'll learn more about Ryan as he introduces himself, but I will say that he's the science manager and shorebird programs director for Oikonos Ecosystem Knowledge. He's also a lecturer at UC Santa Cruz and teaches the field quarter class, which is introducing so many young people into the field of natural history and biology and ecology, and is really great jumping off point for new ideas in our world to protect our incredible nature around us. So thanks, Ryan, for planting seeds in those young folks' minds. And you'll hear about Ryan's research at Mono Lake and with Phalaropes around across hemispheres. So I won't go too much into that, but Ryan, we're really happy to have you here in this Zoom format. So I will hand it over to you. Thanks, Ryan.
All right, thanks, Nora. Can you hear me okay? Great. Yeah, I'm really excited for this too. It's really fun to give a talk where everybody from all over the place can attend, and it's not limited by geography. So I'm excited to share this story with all of you and have our literally hemisphere-wide network be able to tune into this. So the moment of truth is going to come here when I share my screen. How's that looking? Good? Okay. So I'm gonna shoot for about an hour talk here if you're planning your life as an audience member. I know that everybody's got different things doing in the background. And I'm gonna be giving this talk from Mono Lake to Mar Chiquita, a future for Phalaropes and Saline lakes. And I just want to start off from the top saying that I'm going to be talking about a lot of work that I've been doing, but I'm also going to be talking about work that a lot of different people have been doing. And you'll see from a huge variety of places that we've been working. And this is really a network-wide effort to make all this happen. So I just want to start off with a little bit about myself. Nora mentioned I grew up in Mono City, which is near Mono Lake. And this is a picture circa maybe like 1991 or something of me dressed up as the alkali fly, the Phalaropes' favorite food item in the Bridgeport, California 4th of July parade. And those are my parents dressed up and my brother dressed up as other Mono Lake natural history items. So I was raised at Mono Lake by park ranger parents and really have been immersed in this whole Salt Lakes and Phalaropes story for a long time. And I, of course, have gotten into Phalaropes on a different level lately. But so 25 years later, I'm very excited to be working at Mono Lake. You can see my excitement seeing a Phalarope in this picture. So getting out there on the boat and counting the Phalaropes. And I'm just really so excited to be working back home. I've worked as a researcher for the last many years on seabirds, and I've worked around the Pacific on islands and doing various things, but this is kind of my return to Mono Lake. And I work for this nonprofit organization. We're called Oikonos. The pronunciation there is like Oi, Konos. If you struggle with we're looking at that word and pronouncing it. Oikonos Ecosystem Knowledge, we're a conservation science nonprofit. We also do a lot of applied conservation with our science. Our mission is to study and protect imperiled ecosystems by engaging diverse communities, ... I'll show you the rest of our mission in a second, but so we work in imperiled ecosystems kind of around the Pacific. We work in Hawaii, California, and Chile currently. And this is one of the places we work, the Juan Fernandez Islands, this very remote island chain out off of Chile. And we do a lot of work with communities on conservation. So that conservation work, we also seek to do through innovative scientific and artistic collaborations. This picture tells a little story about how we make these ceramic nest homes for burrowing seabirds on the California coast and Hawaii too. So these birds live underground, and we have worked with ceramicists to make safe homes for them. That's a whole nother story, but it's an example of how we seek to work with designers and artists, and not just scientists, and with scientists though, to do applied conservation solutions. So we get to do some really fun stuff and work with lots of different folks. So getting to the topic here of phalaropes, the first question, of course, is why phalaropes? Why this? Why now? You can kind of answer part of it for me with the very first slide I showed of me as a kid with Mono Lake. I really was drawn to work at Mono Lake, and that's one reason that I started looking into what's going on there today and what the big questions are. But maybe if you've been to Mono Lake or Great Salt Lake or one of these other saline lakes where phalaropes go, you've seen a scene like this picture of the phalaropes kind of swirling around in these amazing flocks of thousands of birds sometimes. And I think that's one of the things that really makes people love saline lakes. So you'll see scenes like this, and they really just animate what's going on at saline lakes and give it sort of a spirit that's alive, that I think people really connect with. So that would be my first answer, as sort of just a person. My second answer might be they're really data deficient. We don't know very much about them, it turns out, even though they're kind of pretty visible and right in front of us. They're just hard to study, and I'll tell you more about why. So there's some big questions about them. And then if you take the big perspective on them, they're this really interesting system to look at and species to look at, because they're connecting saline lakes around the whole Western hemisphere is what I focused on. And they're going all the way down to South America. And if you look at this picture and squint your eyes, you might think maybe that's like someplace in the Great Basin or even Mono Lake, but then you see that there's flamingos there. So these saline lakes that the phalaropes go to, they all have very similar looks, very similar ecology, and very similar threats that are connected. And I think the phalaropes kind of are this thread of connection that can help us conserve saline lakes around the world, really. So this is a high Andean lagoon in Chile that looks a lot like home for me. So finally, saline lakes and phalaropes, they're super threatened potentially. We know saline lakes are very threatened, and phalaropes depend on saline lakes. So that makes you wonder, are phalaropes threatened? And this is one example. Unfortunately, I'll show you a number of these kind of photos throughout the talk of, here's 1987, Lake Abert, Oregon, one of these saline lakes looking nice and full. 2015, it's literally dry. Good news is it's come back some since then, but this is kind of the trend that we're worried about, that we've been seeing over the recent years with saline lakes, is that the water is getting diverted for various uses, and also climate change is causing desiccation of these lakes. So I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit of intro about the species of phalaropes. I'm a teacher, as Nora mentioned, so I like to try to make this a little interactive, even given the hurdles. So I'm going to ask you, you can just do this by yourself, but how much do you know about phalaropes is going to be our question. And this is, I'm going to ask you one question here, which is, which of these is a Wilson's phalarope and which of these is a red-necked phalarope? And go. You can think about it for a second. All right, so you've had a second to think about that. You might have noticed that they both have red necks, so that doesn't really help you very much. The Wilson's phalarope is the one on the left, and the red-necked phalarope is the one on the right. And these are the two species that come to Mono Lake in big numbers. And this is their breeding plumage. They're even harder to tell apart when they're in non-breeding plumage, but you do see on the red-necked phalarope that really nice splash of red that gives it its name. And then I like the name Phalaropes tricolor for the Wilson's phalarope, actually much better than the name Wilson's phalarope, and you can see the sort of 3-color action going on the Wilsons. So something that maybe you've heard about phalaropes if you're into birds is that phalaropes have reversed sex roles, and this is sort of their most famous claim to fame as a bird, which is that birds in general, the males are the ones with the splashy plumage, and the males are the ones singing and attracting the females, and the females tend to be more drab colors. And it's reversed in phalaropes. So the females got the fancy brooding plumage, and the females are trying to attract the males. And then it actually turns out that the females, they mate with the male, they lay the eggs, and then they take off, and after pretty shortly thereafter, and don't do a lot of parental investment in the eggs and chicks, and the male hangs out and raises them. So it's this awesome example in nature of males stepping up. And that is, I'm not going to talk a lot about that because we're mostly focused on their migration phases, but that's something that's interesting to know about them and does inform surveying them and things. So when they're breeding, this is kind of what it looks like. It's a nest hidden in the vegetation, pretty camouflaged. And here's our obligatory picture of a cute chick. This chick is, I'm not sure how old, but they grow up pretty fast. They have a pretty short breeding cycle. So looking at the kind of life history of the Wilson's phalarope, I'll kind of be stepping through like Wilson's phalarope, redneck phalarope throughout the talk. So this map over on the right is eBird sightings of phalaropes throughout the hemisphere. And if you see the red up there at the top in kind of southern Canada and northern Great Plains of the US, that's the breeding range where they're breeding in wetlands in the interior. They're stopping at these saline lakes, and we call them staging areas, where they breed, then they go and they stop at the saline lake and they eat tons of food. These lakes have a lot of abundant food, and then they gain weight and they go on, they get ready for their migration, which is a big one. They go down all the way to South America, where they quote unquote winter. It's not actually winter when they're there because of course the phalaropes are following the summer and the hemispheres have different seasons. And interestingly, when we see a phalarope at Mono Lake, for example, they're about to make what we think is a nonstop flight where they're going to take off and they're going to fly thousands of miles to reach South America. And we think they do it over the ocean for various reasons. We think that there's not a lot, that yellow you can see on the map is their migratory path. And that's mostly that you see them going over land in the way home going north. So we don't have a lot of eBird sightings over the ocean, is what I mean. And this is my attempt at a wanted poster, sort of. What I mentioned that they're data deficient, and one reason I think so is because I think this has happened is because phalaropes, they kind of don't fit into our normal categories of like shorebirds and seabirds. The redneck phalarope spends a lot of time on the ocean. They swim around on lakes a lot. They don't hang out on the shore. They hang out at salt lakes, which is not kind of a normal shorebird thing to do. So this is one reason we don't know that much about them, actually. And the population trends of both species are pretty much unknown. There's some suggestion that the Wilsons might be stable, but it's kind of at the fringes of the habitat that's been seen. The world population estimate that everything is based on and the conservation of them is 1.5 million, and it's a rough estimate from 1986, and it could use an update. And it was always a rough estimate when you're talking about that many birds, but this is now over 30 years old, the estimate. And a big unknown that I'll identify is that we don't know very much about their South American wintering habitat. And that is just because of where it is. It's really remote. It has not been very well studied. But we do know a little bit about it. And one of the things we know is that this place, Laguna Mar Chiquita, also known as Unsa Nusa, is a huge place for Wilson's phalaropes, where they go and can gather in huge numbers of like 500,000. And it's also a huge place. So we think of Mono Lake as big, those of us that are Mono Lake residents or whatever, but Unsa Nusa, Laguna Mar Chiquita is 14 times the size of Mono Lake. So I just did a little visual there of putting 14 Mono Lakes into Anza Nusa. And I'll also mention that Mono Lake is also called Kutsapa'a. I'm going to try to list the indigenous names when I know them throughout the talk, because they're the original names and they're important. So the Wilson's Phalaropes, I mentioned we don't know that much about their wintering habitat, but we do know they go to high Andean lagoons in Bolivia, in Chile, and Argentina in the Andes. Again, this photo, if it didn't have the flamingos, you might think it was somewhere in Nevada or something, but this is actually in Chile. And one cool thing about that is that the Wilson's Phalaropes have this association with flamingos, where they hang around in the feet of the Chilean flamingo that's kind of tap dancing as it's stirring up food, and they pick the invertebrate prey up from around the legs of the flamingos in this pretty well-known association between the two species. So the other species, redneck phalaropes, like I mentioned, there's this question, they don't really fall tidally into shorebirds or seabirds. Anatomically, they're shorebirds, but they hang out on the ocean a lot and they swim around a lot. So seabird people tend to think of them as shorebirds, and shorebird people sometimes don't categorize them as seabirds so much. So we kind of end up in this gray zone. They are shorebirds, I'll say that. Okay, so redneck phalaropes, their breeding range, they're breeding way up in the Arctic, a lot further north than Wilson's Phalaropes. They're migrating to these interior salt lakes to fatten up as well, but they're also using the coastline more. And if you look at that map, the blue part down in South America is this off of Peru and Ecuador and Chile. We know very little about them down there, but they're spending their winters actually out on the ocean. And our wanted poster for redneck phalaropes is that it's pretty much the same. We don't know their population trend, though there has been local declines that have been pretty severe in the Bay of Fundy. The world population estimate is maybe a little bit more precise than the Wilsons, but it's still pretty rough, and it's from the 70s to 90s and needs an update as well. We don't have a great indication from the saline lakes how they're doing. And one thing we don't know about them is actually how long do they come and stay when they come to a place like Mono Lake. We don't know if they stay just a few days or if they stay a few weeks or a few months. And as you can imagine, when you are counting them and trying to figure out what's going on, it's important to know whether you're counting the same birds or not. So that's one thing we don't really know. So transitioning to Mono Lake specifically, I'm going to focus a lot on Mono Lake because that's where I've been working, though other folks have been working other places. The interesting thing about Mono Lake for the phalaropes is that it's full of invertebrate food. And I like this quote from Dave Gaines via Sally, that the phalaropes, they're undertaking a 1,000-mile journey, and they, knowing only 1 or 2 gas stations have the right kind of fuel. So the right kind of fuel is really important for them. They need to go to a place where there's so much food that they can count on being able to get the energy they need to migrate. And when you think about, oh, that must be brine shrimp or brine flies at Mono Lake, you're right. But one of those is much more preferred by the phalaropes than the other. And I would posit the question to you, which of them would you rather eat if you had the choice between this brine shrimp and this alkali fly larva? The alkali fly larva might look gross, but if you're a phalarope, it's this one for sure, the alkali fly larva, because it's packed with a lot more fatty energy and calories than the shrimp. Shrimp, if you pick them up and lay out of the water, they don't really look like anything because they don't have any calories for the most part. So studies have mostly shown that phalaropes eat a lot of alkali fly larvae, alkali flies other stages, and they eat very few shrimp. So what kind of got me into this question of what's going on with phalaropes at Mono Lake is that in talking to people that are there all the time and observing, there is questions about, like, are there fewer phalaropes than there used to be? It seemed like people were seeing just seeing fewer phalaropes, and they were starting to get worried. And there was questions like, are they really not as many here, or are they using some other part of the lake? So that was kind of the original question. And as you'll see, this question has blossomed into this hemispheric wide network of people working on things. But that was sort of the original impetus for this. And I'll just point out that humans like to think we know what's going on at Mono Lake. And this goes for pretty much every other place I'll talk about too. But it's a really big place. And this little diagram kind of shows what humans are really seeing, where we tend to go to these very highly visited places, like in Mono Lake's case, it's South Tufa and County Park are the really accessible places that people have historically seen a lot of phalaropes. But this is looking at the eastern half of the lake where it says it's inaccessible to humans. There's really hardly any roads. It's really hard to get out there, even by a boat, to get out on Mono Lake and check this part out. So just because we're not seeing phalaropes doesn't mean they're not there, basically. So we have a goal of, let's figure out what's going on with phalaropes at Mono Lake. And to inform that, how to do surveys there, we want to know a little bit about their natural history there. So this figure is showing the number of birds and the 2 different years with different months there at the bottom. And it's showing males and females and juveniles. And what I want you to take from this is that there's this really big peak that happens in July where the males and the females are both there at the same time. And the birds kind of build up to a crescendo, and then you can see they just kind of drop off and they're gone by September or late August. They're mostly all gone. So that's what's happening with Wilson's phalaropes. You really want to catch that peak in the kind of late July, early August window. And then rednecks have a slightly different thing going on at Mono Lake, where similar graph here with the number of birds on the y-axis and the month there at the bottom. And then each of these lines is a different year. And you can see that there's kind of a more protracted peak with they're arriving in July, but then there's kind of like peak numbers are happening like for a couple of months in August and September. So they're not, which is sort of suggestive that they're not all coming and then leaving it in one fell swoop, but that they might be turning over or different birds are coming. So a little history lesson here that I had to go through to learn how to do phalarope surveys in Mono Lake. You got to see what everybody else has done. So starting off, we have these hippie looking fellows here in 1976. Dave Winkler and the UC Davis Ecological Study crew, they get the prize for the most carbon neutral phalarope survey at Mono Lake. They appear to have gone to the lake on little road bicycles, and then they canoed around in a canoe to count phalaropes. They didn't cover the whole lake, but they managed to count a lot of phalaropes in 1976. The next person to do a lot of work at Mono Lake was Joe Gell, and he did boat-based counts where he cruised the whole lake from 1980 to 1997. And this is where most of our published data on phalaropes comes from Joe and his collaborators from those years. But after 1997, there wasn't really any organized surveys of the whole lake focused on phalaropes until basically the present. There was, however, shoreline surveys that Debbie House has been doing that cover the year 2000 to present, and they catch some of the time that the phalaropes are there, and they get most of the shoreline. But remember, the phalaropes could be way out on the water, and so this is sort of giving us a minimum estimate from these data, but they can help fill in some gaps. And then finally, Margaret Rubega and Bridget Keimel did some surveys in the 1990s. And this is the method that I'm basing the current surveys on, and I'm working with Margaret. And this is the most systematic survey that is the most replicable. So as a scientist, it's like we can go out and repeat what they did fairly well, because each of these counts is a fixed location that we can go and make the same count location. And importantly, this is not trying to capture every single bird on the lake, but it's just going and being able to compare the counts at each of these stations repeatedly over time in a replicable way. So take a look at that map of Mono Lake in December 1991. Look at it, pretty good there. You can see there's a lot of white alkali on the eastern part of the lake. And then I'm going to show you this image, and you'll see that there is not a lot of white alkali on the eastern side of the lake. So this whole idea, we can repeat these surveys, no problem. We'll go to the same boat points. Everything will be easy. wasn't quite as easy as I was hoping. I could give a whole talk on just the nuances of figuring all this out, but basically the white points are the same ones from the 90s. And then everything else that's colored is ones that we've added since then, mainly to deal with the fact that the lake has come up. And some areas you can boat to now that were dry before. And we've also added a shore survey component to see some places that are hard to see from boats. So methodologically, I won't go into the weeds, but we start at dawn, we get out on the lake and cover the whole lake. It takes about 7 hours, and we try to outrace the wind. We have 2 surveyors, and we do pairs of surveys back to back every 2 weeks because there's a lot of day-to-day variability, and we're also trying to sort out what's going on with the day-to-day variability. We do a 360-degree count, 400-meter count radius, and those are all things that we've had to figure out kind of as we go. The 400-meter count radius is the one that works best for being able to see the birds, but also being able to identify them and count them accurately. So I just want to back up here for a second and give you all a tutorial about how to count phalaropes. So pay attention to this part, I guess. So before we begin, you think that counting phalaropes is easy. I know that you think that, but it's actually hard. And what you're probably envisioning is something like this, where Sarah, our observer here, is counting 1 phalarope. And yeah, that's totally easy, like no problem. But I want you to take this little challenge here. It's another interactive part of my talk where you're going to try to count how many phalaropes are in this picture. And then if you think you're really good with that, then try to figure out what species they are. So these are some of our challenges. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. All right, so maybe you counted them. Maybe you got 15 redneck phalaropes. That's what I got. I think that's the correct answer. But you know, it starts to get harder as you get overlapping birds, and they are redneck phalaropes. That can be hard to tell too. So maybe you're feeling confident. You got 15. So now we'll move on to the advanced phalarope counting, and how many phalaropes are in this picture. And maybe that seems like kind of a joke, but this is actually what we encounter. So we tend to encounter groups of small groups that are really easy to count, and then suddenly you land in this because the phalaropes are patchy and they're aggregated. So actually take a moment to try to figure out what you would say if you were tasked with being my job of saying how many phalaropes this is. And I'll give you the hint that it helps. Sometimes we count in hundreds. So I would recommend saying like, okay, what do I think is 100? And then trying to estimate. So I'll give you a little more time for this, so go. Okay, I have no idea, what's going on in the audience because of the Zoom call format. So I'm just gonna assume you all tried really hard to figure this out. And I'm gonna tell you that what I got is 981 Wilson's phalaropes. And that I cheated by taking this photo and using this dotting program to count it, which is not what we do in the field. What we actually do is try to count them as we're going from the boat. So I imagine people probably got a range here of, a pretty wide range of different numbers for this. And I just want to emphasize that all of the results I'm going to show you are subject to this sort of observer error problem. And basically the history of phalarope research is plagued by the fact that they're really freaking hard to count. This is only 1,000, but we get into numbers like hundreds of thousands. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to move straight into results. We've done surveys now at Mono Lake in 2019 and in 2020. And I'm going to show you for the distribution here of where the birds are. This is 2020. So each of these panels with Mono Lake is a different survey. Some of them are right back to back on the dates. And basically the bigger the dot, the more phalaropes there are. The small dots had 0 phalaropes. Black is shore counts and blue is boat counts. And start by looking at the top there at the big black dot at the bottom of Mono Lake. And that's South Tufa, where probably many of you saw large groups of phalaropes. in the last couple of years of Wilson's Phalaropes is what we're looking at. And then look up at the top of Mono Lake and you see there's lots of blue dots there. And that's kind of that no man's land. We call it the Bermuda Triangle, where it's just really hard to get out there for anybody. And that's where we've seen a lot of Phalaropes. And so for the redneck Phalaropes, remember they like to hang out in the ocean when they're not breeding, and they tend to seem to do similar things on Mono Lake, where they like to be out in the middle of nowhere, like it kind of feels like the ocean out there. And you can see there's hardly any redneck Phalaropes at that black dot at Saltufa. I think that was actually 2 that Nora counted once. And for the most part, they're way out there in the hinterlands of the eastern part of the lake. And you can see these interesting patterns of them, they're getting to be more and more birds, and then they're kind of moving around as the season goes on. So revisiting this, I just want to make the point that this inaccessible part of the lake, this is where the Phalaropes like to be, especially redneck Phalaropes, and the South Tufa County Park zones, much as we love them, are really tiny parts of the lake. And I'll point out they do like to be at South Tufa, but it's this little itty bitty piece of the lake, and that there's a lot of the lake going on that is not those areas. So that's why we have to do this whole complicated, protocol, and not just show up and count from one spot or something like that. So I'm going to show some graphs here of the actual numbers of birds that we've been seeing. I'll walk you through them. So we have the number of birds on the y-axis going vertical, and the date on the bottom. This is 2019 counts. And we have the 3 different colors and symbols of the 3 different species. So we're kind of interested in what are the peak counts. We're trying to survey enough that we can capture what was kind of the high count to get a sense of what the population is. And the Wilson's Phalarope high count was about 2,700 in 2019. But I'll point out that on the same day, with some really big error bars, we have this unidentified high count of 12,800 birds. And we're still sort of figuring out what we were doing at the start of the 2019 season. Was our first season. I'll just say that about 10,000 of those unidentified birds were Wilson's Phalaropes at South Tufa. So we had about 11,000 Wilson's Phalaropes, and I won't get into the details of why I'm showing it like this, but it was just basically they were called unidentified. And the red-necked Phalarope high was about 5,500. And then you'll notice there's kind of that protracted up and down of the red-necked Phalaropes that's taking longer and not just peaking and dropping like the Wilsons. And this is kind of what the Wilson's Phalaropes looked like at South Tufa in 2019. So in 2020, same graph that we're looking at here, but a different year, very similar Wilson's Phalarope identified birds high count, about 2,700. But note that the unidentified count is much lower. It's only around 1,000. So if you were to add those 2 together, which I'll do at later points in the talk to kind of show what the potentially highest count could have been for that species, we're only getting about 3,500 or so maybe. And that's pretty low for Wilson's Phalaropes. I'll show you the historic data in a bit. And then the redneck Phalarope high count was actually about double what it was in 2019 and 2020. But look at this graph of the redneck Phalaropes and note that each of these points is like a back-to-back survey day. So we went from like 1,000 rednecks to 10,000 in 2 different surveys on back-to-back days. So this is one other reason why it's so hard to pin down what's going on with them, is because there's so much variability. Did those birds fly in overnight, or did we somehow miss them? It's probably a little bit of both. So I'm going to show you, everybody, of course, the big question is, so how does this compare to the historic data? How are the Phalaropes declined? That's the big question. I'm going to show you some of the historic data, and I'm going to give you a major caveat before to start there that each of these surveys was done in a different way, and they all covered the lake in different ways. I'm going to show them to you because the order of magnitude is interesting, but just remember that each of these surveys is not fully comparable, and I'll show you which ones are the most comparable. So here's David Winkler's 1976 count, 90,000 Wilson's Phalaropes. That's a lot of birds. Never have really quite like surpass that in this graph I'm going to show you. The JoJel boat counts here from the 80s to the mid 90s, you can kind of see these ought to be fairly comparable to themselves. So you can see there's this trend going down, and Joe identified this low point in the 90s where it seemed the Phalarope numbers had dropped a lot, but then they were sort of coming back up. So here's the protocol that we're using currently, this red dot. And there was one count in 1990 that we can compare pretty well to. You can see that the numbers look a lot lower. Remember, we're not trying to count every bird on the lake, but I do think we're getting, none of these other surveys counted every bird on the lake either, I'll say. And then to fill in this gap in the 2000s, remember I said there are those shore counts where you kind of have to take them as a minimum count. And I'm going to put those in there as the minimum, but know that that's not the whole lake. And looking at this, I don't know what you think, but it makes me worried. Even though I know that not all these numbers can't all be directly compared, it doesn't look very good with Phalaropes at Mono Lake. We went from 90,000 in 1976 to 3,000 in 2020. Also note there's a lot of variability year to year. So, we really need more data. It will be a major theme of my talk. We need to keep this up because it could bounce back just like it did in that 90s part of the graph. And I'll just mention that this is really sort of like what we have as the most comparable things here of the surveys that did the standardized method that we can compare. And even looking at that, it looks like a drop. So should we be worried? I'm going to say yes, worry, but we're going to collect more data, and don't be alarmist, but we are going to keep on studying this scientifically. Redneck Phalaropes at Mono Lake, there's not as much historic data that I have available anyway. It's a little bit more all over the place, but still a similar thing of especially the red dots are comparable to each other. And if you compare those, then we have a pretty big drop of about 10,000 birds. 2020 seemed like a lot of birds with 10,000, but there was, we were in the 19,000 range back in the 90s. So to recap what we've learned at Mono Lake in the last 2 years, the timing of Phalaropes is still pretty similar to what the historic survey showed. Birds are using places that are hard to see, and that might answer part of our question of what's going on, is that, they're really just, if you want to see them, you got to go out to the middle of nowhere in the eastern part of the lake. However, the number of birds is lower than in the historic surveys, and that is a little bit eyebrow raising, though we can't say we for sure have a trend here yet. We need more years of data that are comparable to each other. We need to know more about how long the redneck Phalaropes especially stay at Mono Lake to know how to interpret those numbers. And then I will transition to the next part by saying we really need to look at the bigger picture, because it's all well and fine to know what's going on at Mono Lake, but it could be that the birds just went to Great Salt Lake, and that's why they're not there, and everything's fine with the species, but they just are, for some reason, eschewing Mono Lake. So with that in mind, in the last couple of years, we've also done a lot of work to get everyone together from various saline lakes that the Phalaropes use as staging areas, and have everybody survey at the same time. So looking here at this map, we have, these are some of the biggest Phalarope sites from historic data around the Great Basin and the coast. And I just want to mention that this has been a lot of partners that have helped make this happen. Those are the folks listed up there that have done this work, and I want to give them credit for their surveys, because we've all had to work together to make this all come together. And I'll nod to Eastern Sierra Audubon there, that also did some of the Owens Lake surveys and are hosting the talk. So the Wilson's Phalaropes, I'm just going to jump straight into results here. Everybody did different methods of surveying at their site depending on what their site was like. And another graph where we're looking at the number of Phalaropes and over time. We all surveyed in the same week windows, and then the size of the circle is kind of the proportional to how many birds we saw. And Great Salt Lake is just dwarfing all the other sites. And that's not a surprise. We knew that it would be like this from historic data too. So where I'm talking about 10,000 birds at Mono Lake, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of birds at Great Salt Lake. And this is just the 2020 numbers, which were actually relatively low at Great Salt Lake. Again, you can see the Wilson's Phalarope numbers dropping there as time goes on. And here's another counting challenge that I'm not going to make us do, but all these white dots are Wilson's Phalaropes at Great Salt Lake. And so you can imagine being in an airplane, looking out the window and trying to say, how many Phalaropes is that? And you're estimating in tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, bringing us back to our point about, oh yeah, it's really hard to count these things. So redneck Phalaropes across all the sites again. You can see Great Salt Lake still dwarfing the other sites in 2020. Mono Lake's giving a little bit more of a run for the money there, and then the other sites down at the bottom with kind of in the low thousands of birds or less. Really important, even though Great Salt Lake has most of the birds, it's really important that we're looking at all of them so that we know that they're all at Great Salt Lake, because other years there's been 100,000 birds at Lake Abert or Mono Lake. So we need to be looking at all these sites. This is just summing up all the different sites that we saw. We can try to get sort of close to kind of a world population estimate. This doesn't include all the sites that the previous world population estimate was based on, but looking at 2019 and 2020, you can see the numbers of both species dropped a lot, but we got up into the 300,000s of Wilson's Phalaropes. That's another thing that you can tell from this is we know there's at least that many of the birds left in the world if we counted them, assuming they weren't moving around and stuff like that. Okay, and one last graph here before I move on is that here's Wilson's Phalarope high counts from various sites in the Great Basin over time. And this is sort of the big picture context. Again, lots of caveats about how you shouldn't compare this all super directly, but it really shows you Great Salt Lake there in green is dwarfing the other sites, and that the trends are, we're seeing some trends at the little smaller sites that maybe it occurs to me that looking at the smaller sites, you're more likely to really be able to pick up a trend because it's so hard to tell. The numbers at Great Salt Lake are so large that it's hard to see the trend in there. Regardless, we need more data. We need to do this for a number more years before we can tell what's really going on. So what we've learned from these coordinated North America surveys is that there's still hundreds of thousands of Phalaropes out there. That's kind of the good news. It's nice to know that they're still there. They haven't gone extinct. The biggest numbers are at Great Salt Lake, as they always have been, and the trends remain unclear. And we need more years of data. The 2020 numbers looked pretty bad actually for both species, though it was a drought year and across the Western US, and it could be that was just a bad year for them. But it is suggestive that we need to keep looking, because it's not like, oh yeah, the numbers are looking fine. So emphasis on, we need to keep the standardization of the surveys up. We could also use movement data to better understand, are the birds moving between sites? If one site dried up, could they move to another? Those kind of questions. So I'm going to transition to another aspect of this project, which is that we participated in South America surveys for the Wilson's Phalarope non-breeding habitat in 2020. And this was kind of like right before the pandemic came down. So we managed to get this in, and this was a project that was led by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, and I want to give lots of credit to them. Wyconos helped organize the Chile part, but they wrangled all kinds of different groups and people to make this happen in some of their most rugged places on Earth. So in these 2020 South America surveys, one of the big questions was, what's the Wilson's Phalarope world population? And the idea was all the birds, all the adults, the males and females, the juveniles, they're all down at the same time in South America. So if you count them all in kind of a narrow window, you should be able to get a sense of how many there are out there if you cover everything well, which is a big challenge because we have this whole high Andean region and then the lowland Saline Lakes region I have there. This is a continent we're talking about. This isn't just a couple of lakes. So this was a huge process to get almost 200 volunteers participating across four countries in the Andes, in the desert, and lots of crazy places. So 753 sites were monitored, all these red dots on the map. Wilson's phalaropes were seen at 134 of those sites. And we also collected a lot of data on lesser known Andean shorebird species, like the Baird's sandpiper and the Andean avocet, for example. So I'll just emphasize this is a really big job and was no small undertaking. And you know, when I was out there in Chile for about 5 days off road, no road in sight, with the rangers who were taking us out there, and it was some of the most extreme remote places I've ever been. And you're kind of on your own if you get stuck. This might look familiar to anybody that's worked around salt lakes. This is down in Argentina doing the survey. So I'm going to highlight a few places that had a lot of phalaropes. Like I mentioned, before this happened, we didn't really have a great sense of where the phalaropes were. We knew a few places, but part of this was just sort of exploration of, you know, let's cover as much as we can and see where the phalaropes are. So Laguna Pilar had the most number of phalaropes in the Andes. That's in Argentina, over 100,000 phalaropes, and it's up there at over 14,000 feet with lots of flamingos. Salar de Surire in Chile, also super high elevation, kind of near the border with Bolivia. It had 14,000-ish phalaropes, and another place that is more on the radar now that we surveyed it and realized this is a big spot for that. So some of those high Andean places were important, but another thing that came out of the survey is that the lowland Argentina habitat actually had even more phalaropes than the high Andes did. And some of the places like Lago Epequén in Argentina had over 100,000 birds, and they're maybe not as like pretty and scenic as the Andean places. So we probably, you know, need to work on public perception of these places too, to conserve them. And then of course, Laguna Mar Chiquita on Sanusa in Argentina last year had over 500,000 Wilson's phalaropes, which is pretty remarkable. You know, that's as many birds about as we saw in all of those North American sites. These are flamingos in this aerial photo, but imagine trying to count 500,000 phalaropes in that gigantic lake that we talked about earlier. That's 14 times bigger than Mono Lake. So what we've learned so far from the South America survey was, this was really, I'll emphasize, this is the first time that a lot of these sites were even identified for Wilson phalaropes, and just that was a big accomplishment. It made it clear the importance of the lowland sites in Argentina that hadn't been fully identified before. And then it is working toward a Wilson's phalarope world population estimate. And I'll just say, I'm not working on that, so I'm not able to disclose lots of details, but it'll definitely be lower than 1.5 million. And I believe then the number of Wilsons that was observed was around 800,000, but that they're working on figuring out extrapolation from that for coverage of the areas that weren't covered, et cetera. So it'll be less than 1.5 million. So we'll get an update of that, which is great. And this was also the first ever population estimates for a lot of these lesser known Andean shorebird species. So I'm going to transition now into kind of the end of the talk about conservation and what the future of phalaropes is, like the title of my talk. And I'm going to posit this question for everybody: are phalaropes the polar bears of saline lakes? And I'm actually kind of serious here that, you know, we've all heard about polar bears and climate change. Probably most of us haven't heard about phalaropes and climate change very much. So they really are a species. They really are a species that is severely threatened by climate change. And the more I think about it, the more I get worried that they really might be the polar bears of saline lakes. So what's going on here is that wetlands and lakes, saline lakes, are drying up from water diversion and climate change, like I mentioned at the start. And this is happening on a global scale. Many of us have heard the story of Mono Lake, but this is happening to lots of other lakes. So at Great Salt Lake, also known as Piapa, in 1989, this is what it looked like. And remember, Great Salt Lake had the huge numbers of phalaropes. So take a look at this image. Great Salt Lake's gigantic. Look at that right side that has kind of the separate arm there. That's the freshwater input where the phalaropes really like to hang out because it's not as salty and has different prey. And then look at 2016. Great Salt Lake has dried up a lot. So I've read that it's about 50% of the volume has been lost of Great Salt Lake, and it keeps on drying up every year because of water diversion. There's plans for more and more water diversion, and also because of climate change. So this is happening, and I'm showing you Great Salt Lake, but know that this is happening to other lakes throughout the whole hemisphere, and these are the places the phalaropes depend on. Laguna Mar Chiquita its water situation is complicated too. It's a really big lake, but it's definitely in threat of water diversion and has a lot of agriculture around it. And here's a familiar site for folks from the Eastern Sierra of a dust storm coming off the lake when it was at a low point, causing massive air pollution. So the impact on people, phalaropes are cool, and some people care about them, but people definitely start paying attention when something like this dust storm happens. And these ecosystems are really crucial for people too. So this is Owens Dry Lake, which has been dry for the better part of a century, and now it has some dust control on it, but that's a really bad dust storm there. And this can happen at a lot of these different places. So there's a lot of health problems that come from this alkali dust. There's big impacts on the economies if tourism dries up. Brine shrimp farming happens at a lot of these lakes, which is an important industry locally. And there's estimates that lots of money and lots of jobs will be lost if Great Salt Lake continues to decline. And I'll also say that there's a lot of these places that are really culturally significant to indigenous people and other folks, and losing them is a really big deal. I was able to go out with the indigenous community to a site visit down in the Salar de Atacama in Chile with the Peine indigenous community, and they're fighting against mining, drying up their aquifers in the places that they've lived for time out of mind. They're fighting to keep their water there that can help them survive in the Atacama Desert. So this is just one example of communities that really are linked to these areas, and there's a lot of cultural significance with flamingos and things down in the Salar de Atacama, Chile as well. And what's going on in that zone is that there's a lot of lithium mining happening too. So it's not just water extraction for people and for climate change causing things to dry up, but this is what is happening, where the lithium that we use to run our computers, our cell phones, our electric cars that are going to save the climate are having an impact through lithium mining. And basically what's going on is they pump groundwater up, they evaporate it, and the lithium is left behind. In the Andes region, which is right where the phalaropes like to go, has the largest lithium deposits in the world. There's already a lot of lithium mining going on there. And as an example, it takes 52 million gallons of water to produce a ton of lithium, as something that I read. So this is a major issue for the South American habitat, and a big complicated one with lots of different countries too. And I'll just mention, since this is Eastern Sierra Audubon, that the Owens Lake Dust Control Project has been a success to keep the dust down on Owens Lake. It's created habitat for the phalaropes, and we were able to survey phalaropes there and see 1,000 phalaropes down there this last year because the dust control has created new habitat. So that's sort of a plus there. So that's all pretty heavy. Those are big issues, and a little bird with really big issues. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? Of course, and all this work that I just described was really brought about by the fact that we got a lot of people together in 2019, which seems like ages ago, at Mono Lake, but wasn't that long ago, and formed the International Phalarope Working Group. And we were able to get a grant and pay for a lot of folks to come up from 5 different countries, from Argentina and Chile and Paraguay and in different places to all get together and talk about what to do with phalaropes. And a lot of that work, like I said, came out of this meeting. And so now we have the International Phalarope Working Group. We're still working together, and some future studies we need to do is to continue this annual monitoring in North America of the staging sites, continue monitoring in South America, especially these sites that we identified as important, and then doing the whole region. We'd like to do that every 5 years. And then tracking phalarope movements is really important. Like I said, Great Salt Lake's drying up. What happens if Great Salt Lake dries up? Where are the birds going to go? Do we know? We don't know if they can move really flexibly if they find Great Salt Lake dry, if they're going to move to Mono Lake. So that's an extreme example, but we need to know more about how the birds move between these different sites. And we have tracking studies are looking like we'll get them going in the next year or two as we get infrastructure and permits and stuff all going. So conservation of the phalaropes at a species level, basically the bottom line here is we need to determine, are the phalaropes in need of greater conservation status or funding? And by conservation status, I mean, do they need to be listed? Right now they're considered least concern by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They're not listed as endangered or anything like that. They're not receiving funding. We're piecing this together. They're not, they're not a focus. There's a lot of conservation problems, and phalaropes haven't been a focus. But they're a great umbrella species for saline lake ecosystems. And, if the phalaropes are really in trouble, then that's going to be a big leverage point for helping save the lakes. And oftentimes wildlife issues come to the forefront and get people to care about, to make some action for these things. Population data also is really important. And, there's a lot of focus in this talk on the population, but the reason that is because we're not going to get those uplistings for conservation unless we get population data that shows us what's really going on. The reason that we don't have a lot of conservation attention right now is because there's all these data deficiencies, and the people we're just not going to focus on them until we know, basically. So my friend just came in and turned on the light, so thanks for that. So conservation priorities, at other things that I think are really important is figuring out the water situation at Great Salt Lake and Lake Abert. There's folks that are working on this at Great Salt Lake. There's an advisory council that is proposing solutions that have not yet been implemented. This is all very political and everything. Audubon Saline Lakes has a program that's trying to work on some of these issues. In Lake Abert, I've read about what's going on there. There's not a lot of progress being made in Oregon to get the water back for Lake Abert. So that's another really big issue. At Mono Lake, Kutsapa'a, this was actually once the most threatened lake, perhaps. We all thought it was going to dry up in the 90s, 80s, 90s. And now it's probably the best protected of all the lakes that I talked about tonight. Because it had this whole legal story that I won't go into, but it has a mechanism for the water policy. It has an NGO that's focused just on protecting Mono Lake. It's in a protected area. So actually Mono Lake is a kind of shining example of what can go right with conserving saline lakes, but it's only one lake. And the phalaropes need more than just Mono Lake. So climate change can still nevertheless continuing to threaten Mono Lake and causing the water levels to fluctuate. And when we get droughts, the water is declining kind of scarily. So at Laguna Mar Chiquita, Anzanusa, the huge site in Argentina that's equally important as all these other sites, there's an effort to make it a national park. It seemed like this effort was getting close last year, and then COVID kind of hit and I think derailed the political process or delayed it a little bit. But there's a lot of issues with, it's kind of like a beach resort kind of place with lots of development going on the edges for tourism. There's water quality issues from the agriculture. There's water diversion issues. So if this is something that's really probably likely to happen to make this a national park, which would give us a lot more capacity to protect different facets of the ecosystem. And then I'll just say the big picture strategy for conservation that I think we all need to keep in mind for phalaropes, especially, is to look at the big picture. And as I mentioned, you know, I started out this whole process wanting to go back to my homeland to work at Mono Lake, to see what's going on just at Mono Lake, to investigate these local observations that it seems like the birds are declining there. And look, it led me down to the furthest reaches of the Andes to make connections with all these wonderful people in the Southern Hemisphere and across the US and Canada and Mexico. So we really need to think locally and act globally, which is a total cliche at this point, but it's totally true for Phalaropes that we need to save our local places and worry about them. And we also need to be thinking big picture because, like I said, the Phalaropes need the whole network, they need the whole picture. And if we lose the South American habitat or the North American habitat, then we won't have the Phalaropes. So on that really uplifting note, I think that we're making a lot more progress on this, and I'm really hopeful that so much work has happened in just 2 years. There was just a huge outpouring of interest once we got things going. So I have a few slides of giving credit to a lot of people here, and you'll see that so many people have participated. So for the Mono Lake project, it's been a big partnership with California State Parks. There's a list of the funders and other partners. The Mono Lake Committee, they got a boat for the research, which was huge. The Phalarope Working Group meeting, those are the sponsors there. Thanks to everybody. And I'll emphasize thank you so much for those of you that have made private donations to this. That has really helped us keep going. We don't have like some gigantic funder that is that's just doling out millions of dollars to us. In the coordinated North American surveys, all these different folks have done the surveys there. I'll highlight the Tracy Aviary Conservation Fund has funded all 3 of the things I talked about here. And again, private donations have been super helpful. And the South America 2020 survey, this was led by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. We piggybacked on the Grupo de Conservación Flamencos Altoandinos, the High Andean Flamingo Conservation Group that does a survey in the Andes. They already had the groundwork kind of laid. Again, Tracy Aviary funded this project and private donations. Thanks so much. And I will end it there and just say, if you want to learn more about this, you can email me, or we have reports on our website, which is listed there. And again, if you're moved to donate to the project, we could really use it. We're still building up this project as we go and making it happen every year. So thanks a bunch to Eastern Sierra Audubon for hosting this, and thank you all for coming. And I'll take questions. I guess, I'm not sure how we'll do questions, maybe in the chat.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, Ryan, this is Nora here. Yeah, if you end the slideshow and sharing your screen, I can kind of moderate a question and answer session. But I will start with, I saw that Barry McPherson added a question. Hi, Barry. In the chat that says, how was the diet of Phalaropes determined at Mono Lake? And then please restate the comparative amount of brine shrimp versus brine or the alkali fly larvae in their diet.
Yeah, so the diet is an interesting story. So I'll start with the second part of that, which is that so there's 2 different species of Phalaropes, right? And they have slightly different natural histories. But what has been seen in a variety of studies is that the red-necked Phalaropes really focus on the alkali flies and don't eat very much brine shrimp. The Wilson's Phalaropes, there's been more brine shrimp seen in their diet than in the rednecks. And there's been a series of studies. Margaret Rubega, who I'm working with, did an interesting study where she actually kept Phalaropes in captivity and fed them different foods. And one reason that we know that brine shrimp aren't great food for Phalaropes is because when she just fed them nothing but brine shrimp, that was all they had on offer, they started to starve to death. I think she rescued them before they starved, but their weights just were declining precipitously because they couldn't eat enough brine shrimp to keep their body weight up. So that's one indicator. Joe Gell did some diet studies at Mono Lake. I don't actually know how he did it, and whether he made them barf or whether he killed them to see what's in their stomach or how that was done. But that's a good question. Joe might be here. Maybe he could chime in on the text or something. And then there was just a recent study from Great Salt Lake where some folks did go shoot some phalaropes with a shotgun, and then they dissected their stomachs and looked at what was in them. They found lots of evidence of alkali flies and some other invertebrates from Great Salt Lake that are in kind of the more freshwater, but they didn't find any brine shrimp. So diet studies, there's a lot of nuances to how you study diet and how accurate everything is, but the indications are that the alkali flies are the prime thing, and it makes sense because they're so fatty and juicy.
Thanks, Ryan. That's a great answer. Greg Reese, hi Greg, asks, are there plans to track individual birds to determine the length of stay at Mono Lake?
Yeah, great question. So I didn't really have time to get into that, but we are planning to that's one of the things we want to do with tracking studies is put a tag on a bird and then just basically see how long it stays at Mono Lake or at any of the other staging lakes. And that should really go a long way to answer our question of, are they staying for 3 days? Are they staying for 3 months? So we're doing this tagging setup that is taking some groundwork to set up. It's called Modus, and we're putting up towers that kind of can receive we put a tiny little tag on the birds, and then there's a receiver tower that picks up its signal. And if you get these up at enough sites, then and then as the bird moves around, you can pick up where it is, and you don't have to, for a tiny little bird, you don't have to put on a gigantic tag that has a solar panel and a battery that lasts forever kind of thing.
Let's see, we just have a couple more questions. We have from Willow, and this is not about Phalaropes per se, but she says, would you be okay with screenshots of your slides being shared on social media with attribution, of course?
Good question. If there are slides of the data, then ask me. If there's slides not of the data, then sure. Just some of the data might have caveats. I need to, make sure you say what it is.
Ryan, can I put your email address in the chat because the slide is no longer, it's just Ryan@oikonos.org. Ryan@. Okay, we have from your brother, Nick, what are your ideas for getting a better handle on how long the red-necked phalaropes are staying?
That question is pretty much the same answer as for Greg Reese's question about what the best way to do that is to put a tag on the bird and then just see how long it sticks around after you put the tag on it. Or even better, put the tag on it somewhere else and then have it come and see how long it stayed. Because if you catch a bird and put a tag on it, it might freak it out. So you got to think about those factors.
Let's see, I'm going to continue down the list here. David, I think I might skip over your question because Ryan just answered it about tagging and tracking by satellite effort. That is on its way. I saw Modus parts in the Mono Lake Committee office. So those Modus towers are getting built. And then Claire.
The Mono Lake Committee is setting up the Modus towers at Mono Lake too, and has been super great at getting that to happen.
Thanks, Ryan. Claire Ackland says, can their waste be analyzed for diet studies?
Yeah, there's ways to do diet studies that don't involve looking at stomachs, and you can take their poo and run it through sort of genetic, not sort of, but actually genetics studies to see what the prey are. And actually, I think this would work well in the case of phalaropes, because a lot of times you're trying to study something that could be eating all kinds of different species. With a phalarope, you know that they're probably eating brine flies or brine shrimp or alkali flies at Mono Lake. So you could look for the kind of relative proportion of the genetics there to learn more about that. I encourage you to do your PhD on it.
Yeah, we always
all of you
need more
audience members.
research. We also have a question from Charles Bruce. Has anyone tried to use drones to count phalaropes?
Yeah, so there's been some drone work. My colleague Marcela Castellino has tried drones down at Onsanusa, Laguna Mar Chiquita. She was actually trying to catch them with drones and like drops a net on them. It didn't work very well, but she did learn that they don't run away from the drones too much in her experience, and got some cool videos showing that they're pretty chill. We've been talking about trying to use drones. There's all kinds of, something I didn't talk about that I could have talked about at length is the whole debate about whether to use planes or boats or drones to try to do this. And we're moving toward trying out drones, I'll say, at Mono Lake, but we haven't done it yet. And I think it has a lot of potential, but there's also a lot of technical difficulties and a lot of area to cover and things to figure out.
Great. Willow English asks, is there any knowledge on how faithful red-necked phalaropes are to going via saline lakes versus via ocean routes? Could birds be switching from year to year?
Great question. No idea. That's the kind of stuff that hopefully, I know Willow is one of the few people that has actually tracked phalaropes before. So those are some great questions that we will hopefully figure out in the future with tracking some questions about fidelity, but it's hard on such a small bird to track them over many years.
Absolutely. And then we have one last question from Chris Lay, who missed the last 15 minutes, but says, can you speculate on any relationship between the level of Mono Lake and the population of phalaropes? Apologies if you already addressed
Oh,
this.
yeah, no, I didn't address that. And Chris, that's a really big question that it's perceptive of you to pick up on that. The answer is no, we don't know, at this point, what the level of the lake is affects the number of birds there. There were more birds at Mono Lake in the 80s and 90s, actually 76. Like that was when Mono Lake was at its low stand in that time frame. And there was a lot more phalaropes at the lake then. So it doesn't seem like there's some kind of like really nice linear direct correlation between the lake level and the number of birds. But I think it's safe to say that if the lake dried up, there wouldn't be birds there. And that's what happened at Lake Abert in 2015. There are some studies out there that the folks who are working at Lake Abert have put out about, there was an 80% drop in bird use at Lake Abert. There's a tiny bit of water in the lake then, but there was basically the phalaropes were not there when it dried up. Not surprising, but it would be nice to be able to show some sort of like trend that we could predict about the habitat drying up and the birds, but I think that we're not there, and it's pretty, as you can see, it's pretty messy with all the variability to figure that kind of stuff out. And Nora, I just wanted to highlight Barchet's comment too, that if it wasn't clear from the rest of the talk that these saline lakes are drying up, and I cited climate change and water diversion, and basically in the underlining take home point there is that water diversion is what's really drying them up for the most part. Climate change is exacerbating it, but if it weren't for the water diversion, then we would not be having Great Salt Lake dry up like it is. We wouldn't be having Lake Abert dry up like it is. There's contentious local debate, and especially at Lake Abert, about whether that's the case, but it's been pretty well shown that it's water diversion. And, down in these places where they're mining, thousands and thousands of gallons of water to work on the mines, it's pretty clear cut that they're drying things up.
Absolutely. Well, if there aren't any more questions, then we will say goodnight for the evening. And thank you so much, Ryan, for an incredible talk. And thank you all for coming tonight. There's so many of you. Can clap silently to ourselves. And we will be posting the recording of this talk on the Eastern Sierra Audubon Society Facebook page. I will be uploading it to YouTube, and that way Ryan can share it with folks, and hopefully we can have more people hopping on board and learning about phalaropes across the globe. So thank you all again for coming.
Thanks, everybody.